So let me welcome everybody to the departmental seminar of the Department of Social Studies of Medicine. Thanks for joining us in this format that we've by now gotten used to. I still find it unusual. It's very different from the in-person format, but we have a larger audience. And again, today too, we have many more people coming, and that's great. My name is Thomas Schlich. I'm organizing the seminar series. Today we have something special that's going to happen before the seminar as such is going to start. We will have a special announcement to make, and that will be done by my colleague Todd Myers. He will also then proceed to introduce today's speaker, Katrin Solhdju. And this introduction will then be followed by her presentation, which is about 45 minutes long. And after that, there's time for discussion until 2:30. And the discussion, and I will repeat that later on, in the past, we have started to organize it in a particular way, and that is we are asking you to use your chat function to just let us know that you have a question or have a contribution to make. So that's the speakers list for me that I will follow. That has worked in the past, and we would like to do that today too. Okay, so that's just the schedule for today, the timetable. And now I'll pass on the floor the word to Todd Myers.
Great, thank you, Thomas. So I have the privilege of introducing our speaker today. But before I do that, I'd like to make a very special announcement. And I think it's the kind of announcement that deserves a drum roll. So I will ask for some help from my assistant. Thank you for the xylophone roll. So in honor of her 85th birthday this February, which is actually coming up, the birthday's coming up in a couple days, I'm pleased to announce that the Department of Social Studies of Medicine is naming an annual departmental seminar after Margaret Locke, which starting next year will be scheduled around this time each year. As I'm sure you all know, Margaret is one of the founding faculty members of the department. Each year, the Margaret Locke Seminar will showcase work in medical anthropology and closely related fields. Along with colleagues in anthropology, it will be an opportunity to invite scholars who are engaged, who engage topics in deep and committed ways, who offer nuanced analyses in global perspective, and most of all, whose work reflects the spirit and richness of Professor Locke's scholarship. So the yearly Margaret Locke Seminar will also be an occasion to announce the student winner of the Margaret Locke Prize. So if you go to our website for the department, you will find a page for the Margaret Locke Seminar, which along with information about the seminar also has, it is adorned with many book covers of Margaret's work. So I invite you to go and visit. So on behalf of the department, I hope you're as thrilled as we are about this news. And Margaret, if you'd like to say anything, by all means.
Well, I'd just like to say I'm absolutely delighted that this is taking place. It is not something I had envisioned at all, and it's wonderful. When I look back over all the decades that I've been here in the department, I fled from California and ended up here and thought, wow, what have I done? But boy, now I know what I did, and it was the right thing, and it has been the most stimulating department I could possibly have been in over the years. And I can say without reserve that it is one of the 2 or 3, or maybe one of the 2 best medical anthropology programs that there has been, and that it's strong and functional, and it's marvelous to see that it's going to continue in such a positive direction. Thank you.
Thanks, Margaret. I lost my xylophone player, so. But I also have, so thank you very much. And I also have the pleasure of introducing our speaker today. So Katrin Solhdju is a cultural studies scholar, senior researcher at the Belgian Fonds National de la Recherche Scientifique, and professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at the University of Mons. She's one of the co-founders of the collective Ding Ding Dong, an institute for the co-production of knowledge about Huntington's disease. She's a member of the Belgian Advisory Committee on Bioethics and of the group Duped Constructiviste at the Free University of Brussels. Professor Solhdju is the author of several books and numerous essays and lots of other media. But I want to draw your attention to the forthcoming English translation of her book, Testing Knowledge Toward an Ecology of Diagnosis, which it's a fascinating study that blends historical and epistemological perspectives on genetic testing and includes observations from anthropological fieldwork, speculative storytelling, and more, and includes an afterword from her collaborator, Isabel Stingers. The book will be available soon from Punctum Books, which for those of you who don't already know Punctum, it's an extremely exciting open access publishing project. So with that, welcome, Katrin.
Okay, thank you very much, Todd, and happy birthday, Margaret Locke, whom I haven't met ever in person. So I see you very small, now I see you big on the screen. I think I'm going to see you again in a couple of weeks on a screen because we invited you to the biannual conference of the Bioethics Committee.
Right. So you did, yes.
And thank you very much also to Thomas Schliss for inviting me, because that I think was actually him, even though it was also Todd, I don't know anymore. In any case, my English, ever since I moved to the French-speaking world, is in a kind of strange decay, and so I excuse myself for actually reading my presentation to you. Otherwise, it's going to take 4 hours just to say what I say on one page. Okay, so the title of the talk, as you probably all read, is The Fear of Being Duped. And I will start by a strange scene. A while ago, I was, together with some colleagues, summoned to a lunch work meeting at a quite chic restaurant by 2 professors at a medical faculty responsible for training young medical students at a Belgian university hospital in dealing with stressful clinical situations where adequate technical reactions as well as high quality physician-patient communication is of the essence. They were planning to write up a project for a Belgian funding agency dealing with questions of intercultural communication at the bedside. The details were very fuzzy up to the meeting, but that was supposed to change over lunch. The meeting took off with a tour de table where everyone introduced themselves. The 2 physicians specified their teaching practice, which comprised 2 main axes. First, mimicking technically difficult clinical situations with the help of mock-ups that could serve the students to train adequate reactions concerning a number of difficult symptoms. And second, using role play with the help of professional actors as patients representing well-studied patient cases in order to train students with regard to the type of attention that is crucial when it comes to the necessity of revealing dramatic diagnoses or taking existential decisions with regard to therapeutic procedures to be envisioned. So far, so good. The next step was to discuss our ideas concerning the project they were planning to involve us in. One of them started with an example that was supposed to explain their motivation for the project on the necessity of developing intercultural competencies for clinical communication to go smoothly. The father of a rather wealthy Indian family had been in the intense care unit, and the medical staff was at that point sure of the impossibility for him to return from his comatose state. They had therefore proposed to the family to prepare themselves for turning off the machines. The family's answer after reflection was linked to the constellation of certain stars. In short, they had decided that the interruption of life-prolonging measures should wait until a certain constellation of stars would present itself. The storyteller, so this professor of medicine, and his colleague anonymously started to laugh and giggle awkwardly. What an absurd demand, ha ha ha. Wait for the stars, absurd. This story was followed by a more general complaint concerning the mainly Moroccan patients they encountered and who, according to them, far too frequently consulted traditional healers in addition to the biomedical institution. One can never be sure whether they don't follow the irrational prescriptions of an Islamic charlatan, laughing. And so the stories went on and on and on without any of them having the slightest doubt about the fact that everyone at the table shared their strange enjoyment of disqualifying practitioners and patients of other therapeutic orientations, regardless of their origin, religious, homeopathic, osteopathic, or in the tradition of acupuncture. One of the physician's wives, by the way, had consulted a practitioner of acupuncture for her arthritis, as I remember. And it had worked. Her symptoms were no longer present. Even at this point, when the discussion concerned someone close to them and furthermore reported the effectiveness of the treatment in question, their mode of reckless disqualifications did not halt or make them hesitate. The healing was just as quickly explained away as it had been put on the table. Must have been a placebo effect because the guy obviously took a lot of time talking to her. Maybe she needed that. Following the ever same punchline, symptoms that didn't make sense, most notably electrosensitivity, because their causes could not be identified, were in the twinkling of an eye judged as purely imaginary, functional manifestations of psychiatric rather than somatic pathologies, and the persons presenting them accordingly as untrustworthy and at best in the need of curing their minds. You have probably captured that I did not feel very comfortable in this bizarre company that had been imposed on me. To cut a long story short, I managed, even though I was looking for a possibility of funding my next research project at the time, to get out of this literally toxic environment for good. And I don't think, by the way, that the research project ever took on any real form. The encounter, however, had long-standing effects in as far as it took me quite a while to identify and to put words on the problematic that emerged from the diverse stories outbidding each other, the embarrassing collective clapping of hands on thighs, while awkwardly laughing at the stupidity of all those who either were or believed in charlatans, in opposition to trusting the uncontested knowledge and know-how of real scientifically proven medicine. I was too angry to identify what was probably rather the expression of a shared unease, an unidentifiable origin than outward nastiness or pure condescendence. At least I now think it would have been more interesting to give them the benefit of a doubt rather than a cold shoulder. It is too late for that. But it is not too late to take up this memorable lunch and instead of feeding the anger it generated and instead of further caricaturing and judging its protagonists, to wonder whether the insatiable need for disqualification rather than simply being a personal failing could not rather be analyzed as a particularly dense performance of a disquieting trait inherent to modern science in general and medicine in particular. This hypothesis at least struck me as worth pursuing when I recently reread William James' book, The Will to Believe, in which he formulates a captivating diagnosis concerning the strange taste for disqualification on the part of the sciences and philosophy of his time that strongly resonates with the described scene I witnessed, and that more than 100 years ago. I didn't witness that more than 100 years ago. James wrote his book more than 100 years ago, of course. A reading of this text will therefore be at the heart of the first part of my talk. In the second chapter, I will then ask which elements constitutive of the modern scientific and epistemological regime might have played together and made up the questionable robustness of practices of disqualification in the name of science we inherit from until today. And I will then, in a third part, attempt to show for what reasons anthropology and the social sciences more largely on their part did not, as one might expect they could have, managed to at least open up the possibility for an altogether other ethos of research. In my concluding remarks, I will come back to William James and take up some of his propositions pointing towards another, more tactful and polite ethos of science, attentive to the destructive power of disqualification. So first, in The Will to Believe, James puts forward an intriguing diagnosis concerning the moderns. They are, James says, to an exorbitant degree driven by the fear or even the horror of being duped. This fear serves them as something like a founding myth and a shield supposed to protect them from becoming a prey to the persuasiveness and seductive risks they consider to be inherent to irrational attachments, ill-founded beliefs, subjective interests, and imaginations, which they judge, in the name of progress, as historically and culturally overcome, or rather, to be yet and again overcome. Overcoming them means fighting against all forms of obscurantism, charlatans, spiritualists, believers, and all kinds are to be silenced. The fear of being duped, according to James, haunts the sciences and the humanities alike. It surfaces whenever they are faced with enigmatic facts, ambiguity, equivocation, in short, things that cannot easily be apprehended, employing a pre-established system of abstractions. The shield against this fear is made of excessive forms of rationalism, a measureless love for methods, and not least gestures of disqualification that hide away an inability to deal with equivocation and an exaggerated taste for what Isabel Stengers has proposed to call infernal alternatives. Something exists or it does not exist. It is either subjective or objective, imaginary or real, either a belief or a fact. The scientific, presumably neutral perspective seems to ensure a position of control. Contrary to others, the moderns are not situated. Others believe, we know. The moderns, James continues, have become so preoccupied with the need to protect themselves from dupery that they have become ready to pay whatever price it takes for this protection. And taken up by this protective enterprise, they have lost sight of the necessity of paying attention to the effects their fear-driven obsession has entailed, and which, according to James, can be characterized by a generalized atmosphere of skeptic mistrust and sarcasm, just as well as an alarming impoverishment of a certain thinning out, as he puts it, of reality itself. The thinning out must, according to James, be identified as the dark side of the omissions and exclusions of innumerable experiences and realities operated in the name of scientific rationality. It might be important to note that William James, known as one of the first experimental psychologists in the US and as one of the founding fathers, of course, of pragmatism, wrote The Will to Believe that was first published in 1897 while he was holding the presidency of the SPR, the Society for Psychical Research. In this position, he was particularly familiarized with accusations of irrationality, subjectivism, amodernity, and the procedures of disqualification with regard to so-called purely imaginary experiences that accompanied them. In his presidential address to the Society for Psychical Research, 1 year before the publication of The Will to Believe, James launches an outcry for good science, for a good method, and against dogmatism. It is an outcry which is directed against what he identifies as the mainstream scientific laziness with respect to the research carried out on telepathy, mediumship, ghosts, and disturbances in haunted houses at the time. Science may keep saying, he writes, such things are simply impossible. Yet, so long as the stories multiply in different lands and so few are positively explained away, it is bad method to ignore them, end of quote. And he adds, science means, first of all, a certain dispassionate method. To suppose that it means a certain set of results that one should pin one's faith upon and hug forever is sadly to mistake its genius and degrades the scientific body to the status of a sect, end of quote. As we can well hear in this outcry, James is by no means an anti-scientist. He rather reminds his listeners of what he considers to be the more genuine obligation of science, the obligation of looking and analyzing realities as they present themselves and without excluding any of them for reasons of principle. An obligation that, according to him at his time, and in many ways his diagnosis holds true today just as well, I think, risks being forgotten or overshadowed by the exorbitant fear of being duped. Science, James epitomizes things, has organized its nervousness, its fear of being duped, into a regular technique, the so-called method of verification. And she has fallen so deeply in love with the method that we may even say she has ceased to care for the truth by itself at all. It is only truth as technically verified that interests her. Science has ceased to care for the truth by itself at all. That is a powerful accusation. If, however, the fear of being duped has the effect that the truth no longer counts for much, it runs the risk of rapidly transforming itself from a tool of self-protection into a political operation of destruction, mainly animated by the need to disqualify all that might require taking the risk of being a dupe, of making a leap of faith. Contrary to what is all too often presumed, James accordingly argues that this self-protective defensive attitude claiming rationality, disinterested neutrality, and unentangled objectivity for itself and only for itself is anything but dispassionate. On the contrary, like anything that is motivated by fear, it is passionate and furthermore dangerous in its destructive potential. There are two ways of looking at our duty in the matter of opinion, James writes. And we might add two ways that testify simply to distinct kinds of passions. These two ways, he continues, are entirely different and yet about whose difference the theory of knowledge seems hitherto to have shown very little concern. We must know the truth and we must shun error. These are our first and great commandments as would-be knowers, but they are not two ways of stating an identical commandment. There are two separable laws. Believe truth, shun error, he insists. These are two materially different laws, and by choosing between them, we may end by coloring differently our whole intellectual life. We may regard the chase for truth as paramount and the avoidance of error as secondary, or we may, on the other hand, treat the avoidance of error as more imperative and let truth take its chance. End of quote. Authors like Huxley and Clifford, whom James attacks personally as representative agents of the second law, argue that it is better to go without belief forever than to believe a lie, which might be translated as, do not put your trust or confidence in anything that might in the future retrospectively turn out to be erroneous. But James continues, they demanded the exclusion of passions and volitions from the evaluation of evidence and the assent to belief. Yet in making that demand, they actually acted upon a hidden principle of a passional kind, the reservation concerning assenting to a theory in the absence of sufficient evidence derived ultimately from a powerful passion, the horror of becoming a dupe. James himself, on the contrary, adheres to what he presents as the first law, the tireless search for truth. And this law, according to him, imposes on the researcher a certain readiness to take risks including the risk of being a dupe. And he writes, for my own part, I have also a horror of being duped, but I can believe that worse things than being duped may happen to a man in this world. End of quote. Most notably, what can happen is the loss of a truth that could have been gained if the risk of taking a leap of faith would have been taken, a truth that is now lost indefinitely. In short, for James, there is something at once epistemologically and morally problematic to the skeptical position. Epistemologically, because according to him, many truths require for their realization and verification, in other words, for their becoming true, that we meet them halfway. Or as he put it, can we as men who may be interested at least as much in positively gaining truth as in merely escaping dupery, always wait with impunity till the coercive evidence shall have arrived? It seems a priori improbable that the truth should be so nicely adjusted to our needs and powers as that. In the great boarding house of nature, the cakes and the butter and the syrup seldom come out so even and leave the plate so clean. Indeed, we should see them with scientific suspicion if they did. End of quote. But the skeptical position is also morally problematic in as far as it authorizes the reckless disqualifications of the common sense in the name of science on the one hand, and celebrates the so-called enlightened disenchantment of the world it produces without paying attention to its destructive effects on our modes of thought, as well as on the conditions of our existence. James made his diagnosis at the end of the 19th century, at a moment when the scientific endeavor was in the middle of a process of unprecedented acceleration and differentiation. Before we get back to him and his radical empiricism towards the end of my talk, I would, as announced, like to pursue some genealogical lines that might procure us with a better understanding of how the exorbitant fear of being duped gained at least some of its consistency. In other words, if James' diagnosis is correct and the sciences, including the humanities and philosophy, are haunted by a fear that even allows them to no longer care about the truth itself, it invites us to slow down and to try to better understand how the moderns, as you would say, got there. It thus seems to me indispensable to question both the ontological framework of the modern sciences and that of the humanities, and especially of anthropology. How did scientific ontology take shape? What are its procedures and epistemological implications? But also, what roles have the human and social sciences played in the reification of a strictly scientific ontology and the games of truth and the power relations that result from it? A detour through these questions is fundamental if we want to try to identify the reasons why explanations of interventions into the hard realities of diseases and their treatment by other practitioners than biomedically trained physicians are and continue to be perceived as threats, provoking the fear of being duped rather than as potential enrichments that could teach us something, add something to our understanding of the realities of health, disease, and illness. Or to put it differently, what would be the conceptual and theoretical prerequisites for these other interventions to be valued fairly instead of explaining them away? What would be required in order to become capable in accordance with the relevance and effectiveness they unquestionably have for those who are directly concerned by them, rather than disqualifying them as dupes or impostors? It seems to me that what is at stake here is the very concept of nature that continues to govern our ontologies as much as the epistemologies that accompany them. It is the Anglo-American philosopher Alfred North Whitehead who understood his philosophy in the tradition of Jamesian pragmatism, all the while giving it a speculative twist, who in the first half of the 20th century asserted that the moderns have invented a concept of nature. Contrary to what is generally assumed, he pointed out, somewhat ahead of his time, nature is not a given universal, but a datable historical invention. It is epochal, Whitehead said. And this invention, according to Whitehead, was first of all a matter of gestures and operations. These operations were first invented out of purely practical and extremely situated necessities within the framework of the invention of the experimental sciences. Given a natural body, how can we distinguish or more precisely extract more or less invariant qualities that are essential to it and characterize it in its own right? This is the question that animates the experimental sciences, from physics to chemistry, from biology to pharmacology and medicine. And it is to this question that experimental devices give an answer by enabling the sciences to do exactly that, to extract and purify invariants from the bodies under investigation. For being able to do so, they invent operations of splitting or bifurcating nature, or rather natural bodies into various parts. Galileo's inclined plane, for example, a very smooth inclined plane on which well-polished balls roll, friction must be eliminated as much as possible, serves not to empirically observe the process of rolling bodies, but to create a situation that allows to characterize and manipulate the invariant movement of falling bodies in general. This and similar experiments have served as a model for many others in physics, the life sciences, and beyond. So far, so good. If Whitehead is concerned about what he calls the bifurcation of nature, it is not because of these situated operations that allow for extracting and purifying a particular characteristic of a given natural body. What disquiets him is rather the fact that, according to him, the moderns, as he puts it, have transformed this methodological gesture or operation. In other words, their concrete tools for extracting invariant qualities from bodies into a universal ontological regime. The great error of the bifurcation of nature, according to Whitehead, is the reason for its hegemonic propensity must not be situated in the experimental practice itself, in which it finds its origin, but in its reification. Since it is always possible to extract heterogeneous qualities from bodies, it has been deduced that nature is made up of distinct regimes of qualities whose expression are bodies. On the one hand, there would be the real nature, with its own qualities expressed in terms such as matter, extended substance, weight, etc. And on the other hand, apparent nature, with its own regime of existence and entities such as minds, values, the sense of importance, and aesthetics. In other words, the reason why Whitehead and others after him protest against the bifurcation of nature into two systems of reality, modern philosophy's obsession with primary and secondary qualities is very telling in this respect, are not the practical and repeated operations for bifurcating nature in a concrete way. These operations, first of all, simply allow us to abstract and extract certain aspects of reality, to purify them so that we can act with and upon them with precision and efficacy. What they protest against are rather the effects of the reification of this operation, effects that have left us with an impoverished version of nature, a thinned out nature, or emptied and cleaned from all the wonders that provoked astonishment, all the oddities that animated curiosity, in short, from all its qualities that the reification of this operation has established and disqualified as secondary. To put it bluntly, in the logic that emerged from this reification of an operation that at the outset had been invented for purely practical reasons. So the outcome of this was that I put it a bit bluntly, only what could be extracted and purified could yet now be considered as real. Nature, thus emptied and neutralized, could then claim universality. And this modern invention of universal nature went, as Whitehead shows, hand in hand with the discrediting of its secondary qualities, that is to say, of sensibilities, of values and aesthetics, henceforth held to be nothing but psychic additions. Additions that one must abstain from in order to truly access nature. If, however, real access to nature required abstinence from so-called secondary qualities, a posture of disqualification with respect to all those practices that did not allow for the extraction of invariance imposed itself. In other words, practices such as healing practices, as the famous case of animal magnetism and many others show, for which trust, reciprocal influence, or more generally, any kind of relationality was constitutive, and which therefore did not resist well to the dismembering gestures of bifurcating operations, could and would from now on be disqualified or disqualifiable without much ado. They were purely imaginary, manipulative impostures at best, and threatening a realistic vision of nature by producing the misplaced, naive, and credulous trust of the public at worst. The ideal of purification, even though looming since the beginnings of modern science, has, as Lauren Daston has convincingly shown, taken a particular intensity from the middle of the 19th century onward. Before that, Daston precises, it was considered important to control imagination, somewhat like a pharmacon, attentive to quality and dosage. But over the period between the mid and the late 19th century, a veritable fear and even loathing of imagination had taken hold of both mainstream science and epistemologies. Imagination of all kinds had at any price to be excluded on the side of the scientists through self-discipline and additional measuring devices, just as well as on the side of their objects. Medicine is maybe the realm in which the need to exclude the feared influence of the imagination and more largely secondary qualities has most explicitly been institutionalized. As is well known, it represents in a certain way the driving force behind the procedures leading to the formal recognition of a novel compound until today. Known as the placebo effect, the therapeutic power or force of trust, hope, and salutary faith constitutes an integral component of contemporary protocols surrounding decisions to authorize the distribution of novel forms of medication. Current medicine, therefore, officially recognizes these therapeutic effects, yet it does so in a negative mode. Indeed, the double-blind study is specifically aimed at drawing a clear distinction between effects that can be attributed to patients' beliefs or aspirations and those due to the chemical compound itself. This triage allows for the simultaneous conjuring and control of the dangers of subjective influence that threaten the forward progress of medicine. The strategy behind double-blind studies therefore amounts to incorporating the enemy so as to master it once and for all. The placebo effect is the quack's counterpart, as it were, within modern medical pharmacology, thereby assuring it not to be duped. Medical historian Philippe Pignat has demonstrated that the problematic nature of the placebo has little to do with its methodological function as an innocuous compound deployed as a point of reference and comparison in clinical studies for novel treatment options. Instead, the method of the double-blind study became genuinely troubling when it evolved from a technical and methodological reality into a political technique. But what does he mean by this? The prevailing understanding of the placebo dates back to the early 19th century. Yet, despite this, the wide-scale use of double-blind studies only took off in the 1970s. Within the pharmacological research community, it soon became clear that the placebo's presumed null effect was not absolute. In fact, it turned out that patients given a placebo tended to be in better health after the end of an experimental study than those given no treatment at all. Such findings inevitably raised the question of who was responsible for these irrational improvements. There was an easy answer. We are, us, the doctors. It's our doing, it's our influence. This answer turns the placebo effect into what Pignard wants to say when he says that there is a political, or that the placebo effect has been transformed in a political formula. Not only does it authorize Western modern medicine and its representatives to reevaluate the importance of their role in curing patients, but it also disqualifies anew any way of practicing treatment otherwise and anyone who would do so. Moreover, the formula holds a new assumption. You claim to hold secret knowledge, allowing you to intervene upon the bodies of your patients. We can do exactly the same thing. Modern medicine therefore claims two powers for itself. It can heal in the same way traditional medicine heals, and at the same time, there is nothing secret or ambiguous about it, thanks to scientific measurement. A duty falls upon modern medicine as a result of this capture, to enlighten gullible patients and warn them against all the quacks whose practices amount to nothing more or less than a repackaged placebo effect, which brings us to posit the following question. If there are practitioners out there who know how to maximize the placebo effect, does it not deserve another name? It warrants consideration in terms that don't disqualify it from the outset, does it not? It is up to us to strive to follow these practitioners and understand their practice in its specificity rather than dismissing it out of hand, is it not? Are there no cultures out there that have devised ways of sharing these techniques? That was a quote of Philippe Pignard. I come to my third part. If the sciences, together with philosophy, have played a crucial role in the establishment of the modern and universal concept of nature that finds its expression in different dualisms, matter, spirit, neutral, interested, objective, subjective, fact, value, etc., one might have expected that anthropology, when it was founded as a field practice towards the end of the 19th century, would, confronted with other ontologies, the absence of a concept of nature elsewhere, and other practices, have questioned the legitimacy of the ontological reification of the bifurcation of nature. Yet, as Philippe Descola most notably shows in his book, L'écologie des autres, so the ecology of others, the majoritarian way of conceiving and doing anthropology has in no way acted as a counterweight. On the contrary, it has participated in consolidating the hold of the modern concept of nature by giving it its complement, culture. Although it has since tried to act as an intermediary between objective so-called natural realities and subjective so-called cultural realities, it is as if it were trying in vain, writes Descola, to stitch up both sides of the world with very large stitches. And the ostensible scar left by the stitching emphasizes the dissociation rather than dissolving it. Like a prisoner, he writes, anthropology has thus been locked in for over a century to survey its cell, confined between the wall constrained by the mind and the one constrained by practical determinations, end of quote. And this confinement is not, Descola insists, due to the fact that anthropology has not yet found the most elegant or effective way to break out of its cell, to fill the abyss. But it is rather due to the fact that it has allowed itself to be drawn into a logic of problematization that was badly construed from the outset. Any attempt to reconcile the two fields is de facto doomed to failure, Descola writes. as doomed to failure, but not forever, as long as one continues to adhere to the presupposition that underlies this cosmology, the existence of a universal nature that is coded or adapted by a multitude of heterogeneous cultures, end of quote. The conviction that the necessity of articulating nature and culture is a universal preoccupation as such presupposes that the clear distinction between these two spheres is an anthropological constant, independent of a given environment, and not, as Whitehead said, epochal. The idea that any society would produce compromises between the two presupposes that nature is the same everywhere and that only culture is historical and variable. In such a regime, where the bifurcation of nature has been reified into general ontological categories, it remains impossible to even consider the possibility of learning from others, of appreciating their regimes of felicity. Impossible because this concept of nature has a constitutively hegemonic character. They believe, we know. Be wide awake, you might be duped. This shortcoming of the universal hegemony, the incapacity to learn from others, can be seen all the way down to the methodological considerations within anthropology and in disciplines that are close to it, even where they are intended to be tools for overcoming a dualistic cosmology. Such is, for example, the case of the famous distinction between emic and etic approaches. According to this distinction, you probably all know that better than I do, it is important to be able to refer all descriptions of the emic type, so internal to a culture, to etic elements, objective knowledge about them, to which the actors would only give a local cultural meaning. Anthropologically informed ethnobotanists, for example, who study plant classifications by certain groups of indigenous people, generally proceed with this distinction in mind. One step of their research consists in producing an inventory of a local flora in naturalistic terms, so etic. Another step in collecting the names, descriptions, etc. of these same plants and flowers by indigenous populations, emic. However, as Descola puts it, they are unable in a certain way to question the adequacy of the cosmology underlying their twofold approach. Because, and I quote again, the very delimitation of a field of objects comprising plants and only plants, and accordingly the delimitation of botany as a field of specialized knowledge about them, is in itself the result of a division of the phenomenal reality long accepted in the West, but not from a point of view free of any cultural prejudice, end of quote. The destructive potential of taking the universality of one's own concept of nature, and with it the delimitations of certain fields of objects in it for granted, does indeed become particularly patent when having a closer look at some of the concrete effects of this ethnobotanical approach in colonial and post-colonial situations. Maria Paula Meneses shows, for example, there are lots of other studies, but that is only one example, shows in a meaningful way the entanglements between the application of modernist modes of abstraction, their disqualifying effects, and the logic of socio-economic extractivism with respect to local botanical resources. In a text about her research on so-called traditional medical practices in Mozambique, she describes the disqualification processes first operated by the Portuguese colonizers and after independence continued by the government. These processes notably led to the official non-recognition of traditional medicine by the state. The multiple therapeutic know-hows, thus subsumed and disqualified under the term of traditional medicine, had, as she puts it, become non-knowledge. This non-knowledge is, according to her, characterized by the fact that it is considered to be part of nature, but excluded from civilization. This process of disqualification of so-called traditional medical practices was, as she shows clearly for Mozambique, but the same holds true for many other former colonies, accompanied but the somewhat contradictory project of taking possession of the biochemical resources at work in these same discredited practices. To this end, Meninius writes, therapeutic knowledge and practices are fragmented according to the classification system of modern science. This fragmentation of knowledge has allowed the colonial system to appropriate the active principles of the different products used by local therapists. Indeed, by considering local practices as part of modern neutral value-free nature, they and the practices they are part of are transformed into resources that can be bifurcated and from which invariant biochemical elements can be extracted at will. Meninius shows the disturbing continuity of the discourse justifying this type of extractivist procedure through a series of quotations from anthropologists and physicians between the beginning and the end of the 20th century. I will take up only 3 of them in the chronological order of their publication. In 1910, the anthropologist Cruz, identifying sorcerer and healer, which in the Mozambique indigenous tradition are 2 clearly distinct roles, writes the following, I quote, "The sorcerer offers nothing out of the ordinary. He is black like the others. He is only intelligent enough to gain their respect, inducing in them a mystified respect for his clinical procedures, his divination abilities, and his resources to solve various difficulties in life. But in general, he is an imposter." End of quote. The tone changed only slightly after independence in 1975. In an anthropological text from 1979, we read, "There are healers who do heal using certain medicines obtained from roots, plants, etc. But spiritual healing is from all points of view negative and obscurantist par excellence." End of quote. And last quote, in 1981, the physician Servico de Nutracio states, "Traditional medicine is a body of unorganized empirical knowledge whose content is distorted by the process of oral transmission and often surrounded by obscurantist practices such as rituals, etc." End of quote. The Office for the Study of Traditional Medicine, set up by the independent Mozambique government, pursues the self-defined function of cleansing existing knowledge of any obscurantist ideas with which it is usually imbued, thereby promoting, as they put it, its values as scientific knowledge for the benefit of the entire population. It is clearly understood that the project is a project of purification and extraction of the only type of agent present in so-called traditional medical practices that modern science and epistemology can account for, biomedical agents. In other words, practices are bifurcated and not rarely dismembered by separating so-called obscure elements from those that are not, as if separating the wheat from the chaff. The only way to value them, to hold them in esteem, to account for them, seems to be to show that they contain elements that can be assimilated to what modern science considers as evidence. I conclude. My disarray with regard to the physicians I had lunch with a couple of years ago now might be translated into the following question. What elements would be required in order to resist to, or rather to unlearn, or to wean ourselves from the fear of being duped, and to instead become capable of thinking through the possibility of the coexistence, or of what Isabel Stengers has proposed to call an ecology of practices. And furthermore, how to do so without running the risk of abandoning and disqualifying the aspects of modern science and its particular modalities of knowledge production, which we hold dear. In contrast to classical epistemology, the criterion with regard to the relevance of a practice for such an ecological approach would probably not have to be sought outside, but within the logic structuring the practice in question internally. Also, the criterion would not be that of an abstract milieu independent truth in opposite to falsity, and neither would the question concern the epistemological rupture, as classical epistemology has it, accomplished by the practice in question? On the contrary, the central criterion of truth would be that of its effectiveness. In this sense, an ecology of practices positions itself in close proximity to James's theory of truth. A motto pervades James' entire philosophy, which he has regularly identified as radical empiricism. To be radical, he writes, empiricism must neither admit into its constructions any element that is not directly experienced, nor exclude from them any element that is directly experienced. For such a philosophy, the relations that connect experiences must themselves be experienced relations, and any kind of relation experienced must be accounted as real as anything else in the system. End of quote. This interdiction to exclude any experienced element of relation, however, implies that the experience, even of one single person, that a healing practice or any other practice for that matter, scientifically proven or not, is effective, obliges us to include it into our construction of reality. The fear of being duped has no place there. The same is true of concepts and ideas. From a pragmatist perspective, they too cannot be evaluated a priori and in abstraction from concrete situations. Their epistemological value depends exclusively on their consequences, on what differences they are able to make in the world. Their cash value, as James puts it, can only be measured through the experience of those who are affected by this or that idea, concept, or practice. Nothing is true in and of itself. In order to become true, an idea, a concept, a theory must do one thing above all: take hold. That is, provide an instrument for action, as James said, in a given situation. In Isabel Stengers's work, that is strongly inspired by James and Whitehead for that matter, notions of commitment and milieu are necessarily central to what she calls an ecology of practices. Because according to her, it is the condition of a given milieu which determines whether a thought, a model, a theory, an explanation can take hold. In other words, Stengers assumes that every practice is constitutively entangled with an environment or a milieu, might be a religious or milieu or a scientific community, that imposes its particular obligations and requirements on it. Using the example of the pilgrimage in honor of the Virgin Mary, Isabel Stengers illustrates the ecological project of a symmetric approach to milieu-specific truth procedures in a particularly striking formulation. And I quote, "To imagine that she, the Virgin Mary, could have made her existence known independently of the pilgrim's faith and trust, that is, to play the role befitting her in a situation concerned with how to represent her, is tasteless. To understand the pilgrimage as a practice that aims at obtaining what is the pilgrim's experience of transformation requires that we do not conclude that since Mary cannot prove her existence, she is only a fiction, by evoking the general categories of superstition, faith, or symbolic efficacy, thereby explaining away what happens to them. Rather, Stengers writes, we should draw the conclusion that Mary needs a milieu that is inconsistent with scientific requirements." End of quote. Following Stengers, we might then identify what we crucially need to learn in order to become capable of resisting the destructive effects that come with the fear of being duped. We need to learn not only how to theorize, but how to feel, sense, and inhabit a world where practices and milieus, which are inconsistent with scientific requirements, do very well exist. I think it has become clear that there remains a long way to go for collectively unlearning perceiving them as a threat for collectively unlearning the fear of being a dupe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katrin.